For example, if I am a clinical researcher and I'm investigating a drug, and the sponsor, the manufacturer of this drug, is giving me a lot of money to carry out that research, it could be that informally or unconsciously I'm under a lot of pressure to demonstrate that the drug is successful and is powerful and doesn't have many side effects.
Welcome to the Research for Good podcast. My name is Professor David Ellis, and today I'm joined by Dr Rossella Salandra, who is an Associate Professor in the School of Management. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Of all the things that you could pick to research, why were these topics the one that stood out?
I've never had a clear plan, so I'm not going to lie and say this was the plan from the beginning. So when I work in the industry, I was consulting for pharmaceutical companies. So when I started my PhD, my advisor said, well, we have to do something to do with pharmaceutical because it's your interest in healthcare. And I think that was the right choice because, I have expertise and knowledge around that. And the reason why we started looking at selective reporting was because he had just read a book called Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre. It was very popular at the time. It became a bestseller. And that the book just got us thinking about this issue around transparency and quality of reporting.
Somebody listening to this might suddenly think, well, scientists just share their research through the same hundreds of years old system and they publish it in a journal and then off it goes. Is that what we're talking about?
This is what we're talking about. So when we think about the dissemination of research, we mostly think in terms of scientific publication. And this is something that I've been looking at. Particularly, I've been looking at something called selective reporting, which is a phenomenon that has been studied quite a lot in clinical research, not so much in other disciplines. And selective reporting is about carrying out a research study, but then when it's time to publish, only select a certain outcome for publication. And typically when you're selecting these outcomes, you're selecting stuff that is positive or significant, and you may leave out other results that are not so interesting or may even have some disadvantages. Think, for example, in terms of side effects of a drug.
I mean, this might sound like a silly question, but, presumably there's motivations for leaving out the negative stuff and just going with the positive stuff.
Yeah, I think as a researcher, we are under a lot of pressure to publish positive results. Quite simply, it's very difficult for us to publish. If we conclude a study by saying, oh, and by the way, there was no result, it becomes very difficult for us to publish that study. But then things become even more complicated if, for example, we're paid to do our job by industry. So, for example, if I am a clinical researcher and I'm investigating a drug, and the sponsor, the manufacturer of this drug, is giving me a lot of money to carry out that research, it could be that informally or unconsciously, I'm under a lot of pressure to demonstrate that the drug is successful and is powerful and doesn't have many side effects.
Yeah, and of course, before the drug even got to that point, it's probably cost huge amounts of money to get just to that stage.
It's an investment, it's a huge investment, and so you obviously want to make sure that that investment was paid back in terms of having positive outcomes.
So some people listening might be really surprised that this goes on. So what do we do?
Yeah, so in one of my papers, I've been looking at possible explanation for selective reporting. And, you could look at a bunch of stuff, but I focus only on two antecedents, which are whether or not there is a firm employee in the author team and whether or not you're investigating a drug which is incremental or whether it's a drug that is a breakthrough. And as you mentioned, if you're investigating a drug that is a breakthrough, the incentive and the pressure become higher because probably that took a lot of time and investment to research. And what I did find is that selective reporting is not random. So these characteristics of the scientific teams or characteristics of the drugs being investigated play a role. And going back to your second question of what we can do about it, I think its ultimate goal is to make sure that the scientific production system is accurate and is transparent. And I think what I try to do with that paper is to try to add a few pieces of the puzzle and try to understand what makes selective reporting more likely, and hopefully try to find ways to make those pressure less relevant, and find ways to create some disincentive for selective reporting as well.
So I guess this comes at a really interesting time where there's lots of discussions around the importance of, say, openness within research, open data, open materials, pre-registration, so people basically saying up front, this is what we're going to do. Does that play into these incentives?
Yeah, it does, for sure. So one of the big issues with the scientific publication is that it's very easy. The process is very fluid. So you can start with a question and then end up with different questions, and that's just the nature of it. But sometimes you want things to be a little bit more structured. And for example, you want to be able to state in advance what are the questions and what hypotheses you are testing. And this is where pre-registration comes into place, because when you're pre-registering a study, you're basically saying, these are the questions that I want to ask, and these are my hypotheses, and they're locked. You can't change them after. So it's not just about the registration. Once you register your study, you also have an obligation to publish the results of the study once the result is completed. So there is a little bit that you have to do at the beginning of the study, which is saying, this is what I'm going to do. But also at the end, you have to go back to the same platform and say, by the way, these are my results. Basically, many researchers have seen historically is that not a lot of people bother with going back to the platform and actually saying, by the way, this is what we found. So they don't reported the results of their study. And when my colleague and I started our research project, we knew that for sure in the past this regulation around the results disclosure had not been respected. But we didn't know much about the timing of the disclosure, and also we didn't know much about how the disclosure actually works. So we look at three elements. First of all, how quickly the results are reporting. Second, strangely, it is possible on this trial registry to amend the record. So even if you lock in your registration at the beginning, you can go back and make some changes. So that's the second outcome we look at, whether or not the investigators go back and actually change the predefined outcomes. And the third thing we looked at is whether a researcher attach scientific publication to a record and whether this publication have a positive tone. So the question then is not so much do investigators disclose or not, is even if they disclose, how do they do it? So do they do it quickly? Do they tweak the record as they go on? And also, do they attach publications that are worded very positively?
And what was the answer?
And the outcome was interesting. So we linked all these three points to competition, and the type of clinical trials we looked at were trials that were sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. So we limit ourselves to industry-sponsored trials. Surprisingly, we found that under intense competition, firms disclose faster. Competition actually has a positive effect because it's forcing firms to post the result quickly. However, there is a trade-off, because yes, the results are posted quickly. However, we see a lot of amendment on the trial record, which is problematic, particularly if you're changing your predefined objectives. And we also see that the scientific publication attached to this record have a very high rate of a very positive tenor, which is surprising because you would expect the tenor of the publication to be equally distributed.
That's really interesting. So that suggests that things are there. There are more systems now to be open, if you like.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily leading to perhaps the changes that we might expect on their own.
So in a way, this is what our study is saying, that there is a system, but there are ways around the system as well. But I think, it's important not to draw a very dark picture. I think pre-registration, particularly in the clinical trial setting, was successful. And in fact, when we talk about selective reporting, we have seen that over time, selective reporting is becoming less prevalent. And probably this is thanks to these systems such as public registries and pre-registration. And the issue is, we're looking at clinical research. Clinical research is a little bit like a canary in the coal mine. It's been looked at a lot. And I think other fields are trying to learn from it, but we're lagging behind, even in management and business studies for sure. It's also a matter of the type of outcomes that you're considering. So if you're considering outcomes that are really well defined, if a person dies or not, that's really clearly an outcome. But if you're dealing with more soft outcome, then they're much more difficult to pinpoint. And I think that's when selective reporting becomes even more dangerous, because it's much more difficult to detect.
So in terms of your work, you've obviously been investigating the sort of impacts of these changes to systems. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, beyond the sort of, we found this thing, what's the kind of next stage for changing those systems in management?
Yes, for example, one of the questions that I've been asking in one of my studies is, can science fix itself? For example, we know quite a lot about the system of retraction. So we know that, if there are faulty papers out there, there is a retraction system whereby those papers can be removed by the literature. And we know that these systems are more or less effective. So retracted paper, for example, continue to be cited, which is problematic. So in one of my papers, we looked at other softer ways to correct the literature, and we look at bias rating, which is a concept that is very well used in clinical research. So in clinical research, they have something called systematic literature review, and this literature review essentially summarizes all prior evidence. But what is very interesting with these reviews is that they also attach a quality rating to the papers being reviewed. And it's a very simple system, it's a traffic light. So green means good, red, paper is problematic, and amber, so-so. And this is something that we don't really do in our field. So what we found in this study is that when you do attach this label to this paper, this label does send a strong signal to follow-on researcher. And specifically, if a paper is deemed at high risk of bias, the follow-on citation decrease, which means that people pause a moment and think, can I really build my research on this paper? So this is one of the systems that could be put in place, try to fix the literature, and maybe an idea for our field as well. Really think in terms of the strength of the evidence of the individual publication and whether they are worth building on in terms of follow-on research.
Do you think sometimes that junior academics in particular then start to worry more about the quality of work in a bad way? Because when we start talking about, say, systems to sort of flag how good or bad work is, sometimes that can make people worry more.
No, for sure. I think this is the problem when you start talking about system to flag the quality of the research. There is a risk of doing a finger-pointing exercise, and I think that would be wrong. It would be wrong to sort of put the blame on individual researcher. I think it's a system issue. It's not a matter of a few bad apples. I think it's just the incentives that we're working under need to change. So, I think that's really important. Otherwise, you don't even feel free to experiment anymore with your work, which is important as well.
So in terms of future directions for your work, what's happening now? What's next?
So I feel like I'm becoming more and more interested in these ways to make research more open and more accessible. And perhaps I can tell you about 2 projects that I'm working on that direction. So the first project I'm working on is looking at the impact of language translation. So the issue that we're trying to tackle is the fact that the vast majority of the academic literature out there is in English, and that's a mismatch considering that, the academic community is very international. So in this project, we are looking at what happens when you take a paper written in English and you translate the abstract of this paper into a different language. So what happens in terms of the attention that this paper is receiving internationally? And we're asking this question because if a simple intervention such as translating a short abstract can increase the international relevance or appeal for a paper, I think that would be a very good outcome towards this goal of making research more open, accessible, and democratic as well. The second project I started working on is a project on citizen science. It's about involving the general public and or non-scientists in the scientific process. So you basically bring in the research team some individual that may not have a scientific background, but they have lived experience or they know about the topic. Specifically, we're looking at this in the context of medical research and in the context of public and patient engagement initiative. So the question that we're asking here is, this PPI initiative they have been pushed a lot in medical research, and I think it's very clear that they are positive in terms of societal impact. Essentially, you have a patient advisory group coming to sit in your meeting and advising you on what is important and what questions you should be asking. What is less clear is whether bringing these non-scientists or non-experts to the team comes at a cost in terms of compromising the quality of the research. So the question that we're exploring is whether bringing these citizens into the research project can actually advance science as well as societal impact.
Are all these things we've touched on, do you think they're changing what it means to be a scientist in the 21st century?
I hope they do. In the sense that I think traditionally you always look at a scientist very isolated, looking to communicate with their own community of reference, but this is now changed. We are under a lot of pressure to deliver societal impact, so to open up our research, to make it more accessible, to make sure that this research can be accessed by people that are not necessarily academic, but also to engage these individuals in the research project. I think it's changing for the best. At least this is my view of what research should look like, and avoid the danger of being very insular and not communicating with the external world. So I think it's exciting.
You've been listening to the Research for Good podcast. To find out more about research in the School of Management, you can visit our website or click the links in the episode description.